The Venmo notification hit his phone at 3:02 in the morning. Not an alert he was expecting. Not a transfer from his assistant. Not a reimbursement from one of his board members. Not a charity deposit. Just a random $8 request from a name he had never seen before in his life. A name attached to nothing. No profile picture. No note. Just $8 and a username that looked like it had been created by someone who had never used Venmo before in their life. The kind of username that had too many numbers in it. Like somebody just mashed the keyboard and hoped for the best. $8. The amount alone was almost insulting. Not because he was too rich to care about $8, though he was, but because nobody who knew him would ever Venmo request him for $8. His CFO moved money in increments of 6 figures. His personal chef billed monthly. His housekeeper had a standing transfer. $8 from a stranger at 3 in the morning was so far outside the normal rhythm of his world that it stopped him cold. The way a single wrong note in a symphony stops everything. His name was not important yet. What was important was what he did next. He could have dismissed it. He could have declined the request and gone back to whatever it was that billionaires do at 3 in the morning when they can't sleep. And he could not sleep, had not slept properly in 4 months. Since the divorce was finalized, since the penthouse started feeling less like a home and more like an expensive waiting room for a life he was not sure he wanted anymore. He could have set the phone face down on the marble nightstand, the one that cost more than most people's cars, and stared at the ceiling the way he had been doing for the past 2 hours. He could have done any of those things. Instead, his thumb hovered over the number attached to that Venmo account. It was a 614 area code. Ohio. He had no business in Ohio. No friends in Ohio. No connections, no investments, no properties. He had flown over Ohio hundreds of times in his private jet and never once looked down. And yet here was this 614 number attached to this $8 request at 3 in the morning, and something, some instinct he could not name, some flicker of something that had not been lit in a very long time, made him press call. The phone rang twice. On the third ring, a child started crying. Not the sound of a child who had been woken by the phone. Not the fussing of a toddler who wanted a bottle. This was a child who had already been crying before the phone was answered, already in the middle of something terrible, already deep inside a pain that had been going on for a while. The crying was a kind that comes in waves, that catches in the throat, and then breaks open again, wet and raw and desperate. The kind of crying that happens when a child runs out of words, and all that is left is the sound of being completely and utterly alone. He sat up in the dark. The penthouse was silent around him, except for the distant hum of the city 42 floors below. New York at 3 in the morning is never truly quiet. There is always the murmur of it, the pulse, the suggestion of a million lives happening all at once below your feet. But in that moment, the only sound that mattered was coming through his phone. A child, crying, on a wrong number call at 3 in the morning. He said hello. The crying did not stop, but it shifted, changed quality, became aware of him. He said hello again, and this time he kept his voice very low and very careful, the way you'd speak near something that might bolt if you moved too fast. A small voice said, "Who is this?" Not as a question, not with a question mark. Just 3 flat words spoken by a child who sounded like they were between 7 and 9 years old, who sounded like they had been alone for a while, who sounded like they were not entirely surprised that a stranger had called, because at that point, a stranger was all there was. He told the truth. He said he was nobody. He said he had gotten a Venmo request from this number, and he called to see if it was real. The small voice was quiet for a moment. Then it said, "She told me to do that." He asked who. The voice said, "Mama." And that was the moment. That was a specific, exact moment when his whole life, the 47 years of it, the $1 billion of it, the marriages and the divorces, and the board meetings and the private jets and the skyline views and the emptiness that had settled into him like a fog he could not name, all of it went very quiet and very still, and something that had been asleep inside him for a long, long time opened its eyes. He asked where Mama was. The voice said she was on the floor, and she would not wake up before this story goes any further, because it is going to go to places that will break your heart open and then rebuild it into something stronger. If you have not subscribed yet, do it right now. Hit that subscribe button. Share this with someone who needs to hear a story like this tonight. And drop something in the comments. Your name, where you're from, anything. Because you're about to go on a 4-hour journey, and the community watching this with you deserves to know you're here. This story is for every person who ever felt invisible, for every child who ever sat in the dark, waiting for someone to come, for every person who thought their best days were behind them. Subscribe, share, comment, and then come back. Because what happens next will change the way you think about wrong numbers forever. He was already out of bed. This is the thing about human beings that no amount of money can change. The sound of a child in trouble does something to the nervous system that bypasses every layer of civilization, every wall you have built, every calculation you have learned to make before you act. He was already on his feet, already moving to the penthouse, barefoot on cold marble, phone pressed his ear, listening. He asked the child very carefully if Mama was breathing. The child said they did not know. He asked if they could see her chest moving. A long pause, the sound of small footsteps. Then the child said, a little bit. He breathed. She was breathing. Okay, she was breathing. He asked how old the child was. The voice said 8. He asked if there was anyone else in the house. The voice said no. He asked if the child knew their address. Another pause, longer this time. Then, slowly, uncertainly, a street name, a house number. And then the child said Columbus. Columbus, Ohio. And he had the 614 number already. Already knew it was Columbus. But hearing the child say it made it real in a way that the area code had not. He asked the child to stay on the line. And he did something that, later, people who heard this story would find almost impossible to believe. He put the child on hold, not to abandon them. Not because they were less important than whatever was on the other line. He put the child on hold for exactly 45 seconds while he called 911, gave them the address, and told them there was an unresponsive adult and a child alone in the house. He told them to hurry. He told them he would stay on the line with the child. He went back to the child. The child was still there. He exhaled. They stayed on the phone together for 11 minutes while the sirens moved through the streets of Columbus, Ohio, 42 floors below nothing. For 100 miles from everything, a man who owned 7 companies and could not sleep, and a child sitting on the floor next to their mother who would not wake up, and in those 11 minutes, while he walked slow circles around his penthouse in the dark, he asked the child their name. The child said Charlie. He said that was a good name. Charlie said thank you in the small, polite way that children say thank you when they've been taught manners, and they are using those manners now, because they do not know what else to do, because manners are something you can hold on to when everything else is falling apart. He asked Charlie if Mama had told him to Venmo anyone before she fell down. Charlie said yes. Charlie said Mama was sick, and she wrote the number on a piece of paper, and she said if anything happened to call this number and say they needed $8. Charlie said Mama practiced it with them. The words exactly, $8, because she said it would make sure the person called back. He stood very still in the middle of his dark penthouse. He asked Charlie to say that again. Charlie said it again. Mama was sick. She had written the number on a piece of paper. She had taught Charlie exactly what to say in the Venmo request. $8, nothing else, because she said if you send someone a Venmo request for $8 in the middle of the night, they will call you back. She had practiced it. She had planned it. She had made a plan for the moment when she could no longer be there. And the plan was $8 on Venmo, and the number was his. He asked Charlie how Mama had his number. Charlie said they did not know. He asked Charlie if Mama knew him. Charlie was quiet for a moment. Then Charlie said, she said you owed her one. The sirens were very close now, through the phone, coming to the darkness of Columbus Street at 3 a.m, and he could hear Charlie moving to the window to watch for them. And he said, stay inside, Charlie. Stay inside until they knock. And Charlie said, okay. And then the knock came, and the voices of the paramedics came to the phone. And Charlie set the phone down, but did not hang up. And he stood in his penthouse and listened to the sound of people doing their jobs, people doing the work of saving a life. And then a paramedic's voice said, son, is anyone else here? And Charlie said, there's a man on the phone. And the paramedic picked up the phone and said, sir, who are you? And he said, I'm... And he stopped because he genuinely did not know how to answer that question right now. He said, I'm a friend. I called 911. Is she going to be okay? The paramedic said they were working on it. The line went quiet. Not dead, just quiet. The quiet of professionals doing something serious. He set his phone on the kitchen island and looked at it for a long time. She said you owed her one. He had no idea who this woman was. No memory of a 614 number. No memory of a Columbus connection. No face that rose up when he tried to place her. He owed her one. $8 at 3 in the morning, and a child named Charlie sitting on the floor next to an unconscious woman who had planned carefully and deliberately for possibility that she would fall, and the plan had involved him. He did not go back to bed. He stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his penthouse and looked at New York and tried to remember, tried to find her in the catalog of his life. 47 years. A life that had taken him from a very specific kind of small to a very specific kind of enormous. And somewhere in the middle of that journey, somewhere in the geography of who he used to be before he became what he was now, a woman in Columbus, Ohio had decided that if the worst happened, she would send $8 on Venmo to his number and teach her child to say he owed her one. He started going back. Not physically. Not yet. But in his mind, he went back. The way you go back when something forces you to, when the past reaches forward and grabs you by the collar and says, "Not yet. You don't get to forget yet. There is still something here that belongs to you." He grew up in Cincinnati. That is relevant. Cincinnati is Ohio. And Columbus is 2 hours from Cincinnati. And before he was who he was now, before the first million, and the first company, and the first time he saw his own name on a Forbes list, he was a kid from Cincinnati who drove an old pickup truck and worked 3 jobs and 8 gas station sandwiches, and thought that wanting more made him selfish until someone showed him it did not. He did not remember her name yet, but he was getting closer to the time. He called his assistant at 3:40 in the morning. His assistant, a man named Douglas, who had worked for him for 11 years and had answered calls at every hour and on every continent, picked up on the second ring the way he always did, and he told Douglas what had happened, the Venmo, the child, the ambulance, the woman who said he owed her one, and he told Douglas he needed everything. He needed every Columbus, Ohio connection in his history, every 614 number, every name, every face, every interaction from before, from way before, from years that predated the version of himself that Douglas had always known. Douglas said he would start immediately. He said, and Douglas, he paused. He said, find out which hospital they took her to. Douglas said he was already on it. He went and stood in his shower for a long time with the water very hot, and his eyes closed, and he went further back. He went back to the years before. The years of the truck and the gas station sandwiches and the 3 jobs. He thought about the faces from that time, the people who had mattered and the people he had left behind, and the people who had left behind and the people who had believed in him before he believed in himself. There was a woman, not a romantic story, or not primarily. More than that, different than that, a woman who had sat across from him in a diner. Not a nice diner, a very ordinary diner with sticky menus and coffee that came in mugs that had been washed 1,000 times, and had listened to him talk for 3 hours about an idea he had. An idea that everyone else in his life at that point had told him was stupid or impossible or both. She had listened to the whole thing, and she had not said it was stupid. She had said, do it. She had said it so plainly and so certainly that it had knocked the breath out of him, because he was used to having to defend the idea, used to building cases and presenting arguments, and she had just said, do it the way you say, of course, to something obvious. He had not done it immediately. It had taken him another year. But when he did it, when he finally did it, he had thought about that diner and that woman and those 2 words. Was that her? He did not know her last name. He barely knew her first. She had been passing through Cincinnati on her way back to. He squeezed his eyes shut under the hot water. On her way back to Columbus. She worked in health care. He remembered that. Something in health care. He turned off the shower. He stood there dripping and very still. Charlie. Something in the way Charlie had said that word. Mama. Not as identification, but as title. As a name for the whole world. The way children say it when they mean everything. And something in the way this woman had planned for the possibility of her own collapse, had planned with the specificity of someone who knew their body was not reliable, who had lived with uncertainty long enough to make peace plans and backup plans and $8 Venmo plans. His phone was ringing. It was Douglas. Douglas said, she is at Mount Carmel Hospital in Columbus. She is stable. She had a seizure. She has a condition, Douglas read from something, a neurological condition that causes recurring seizures. She has had it for 3 years. Charlie was taken by a neighbor who came over when the ambulance arrived. Charlie is safe. He said, "What is her name?" Douglas said, "Her name is Elena." He said, "Say that again." Douglas said, "Elena. Elena, Chris. 39 years old." He sat down on the edge of his bed, and the towel was still around him, and New York was still humming 42 floors below. And it was now 4 in the morning, and the name Elena Chris moved through him like water finding its level. He knew that name, not from a diner in Cincinnati, not from years of gas station sandwiches, from something earlier, something so early that it felt less like a memory and more like a dream he had almost convinced himself had not happened. He knew that name from a year. He was 23 years old and broke in a way that was not romantic, but actual, the kind of broke that had a smell and a texture and a temperature, the kind of broke that follows you into your sleep. He had been in a hospital that year, not as a patient, as someone sitting in a waiting room for a reason he had not told anyone, a personal reason, a family reason, the kind of reason that makes you sit in a hospital waiting room at 2 in the morning when everyone you know is asleep and you cannot call anyone because there is no one to call, or there is no one you want to call, because explaining it would cost more than you have at that moment, and what you have at that moment is already zero. Elena Chris had been a volunteer at that hospital, not a nurse, a volunteer, someone who walked through waiting rooms at night giving out coffee and granola bars from a cart, someone who had smiled at him when smiling at him was the most countercultural act imaginable, because he had been sitting in that chair radiating "do not approach me" with every molecule of his body. She had offered him coffee, and he had said no, and she had left a granola bar on the chair next to him without asking and walked away, and he had eaten in the dark while his family crisis resolved itself 2 floors above him, and it had been the best granola bar of his life, not because of what it was, but because of what it meant, which was that someone had seen him sitting there and had decided he was worth a granola bar even when he was giving off every possible signal that he was not worth anything at all. He had tried to find her the next morning to say thank you. She was gone. Her shift was over. The woman at the front desk did not know who he was talking about. He had written a thank you note on actual paper, which he had asked for from the front desk, and left it with the volunteers coordinator. And then he had driven back to Cincinnati in his truck. And 3 weeks later the idea had come to him, and a year after that he had done it, and 24 years had passed. 24 years. And Elena Chris, 39 years old now, was in Mount Carmel Hospital in Columbus with a neurological condition, and an 8-year-old child named Charlie, who knew how to send a Venmo request, and had been taught to say you owe her one. He called Douglas back. He said, "Book me on the first flight to Columbus." Douglas said the first commercial flight was at 6:15. He said, "Not commercial." Douglas said he would have the plane ready. He hung up and looked at his phone for a moment, and then he looked at the Venmo request still sitting in his app. $8. He approved it. He approved the $8, and then he sat there in his dark penthouse and felt something move through him that he had not felt in 4 months, or maybe 4 years, or maybe longer than that. Something that was not quite happiness and not quite grief, but was somewhere between the two, in the country between them, where the most important things in a human life tend to live. He packed a bag. Not a big bag. Not the rolling luggage his assistant usually packed for him. Just a bag. The kind you grab when you're going somewhere and you are not sure exactly what you're going there for, but you know you need to be there. He put in clothes for 3 days. He did not think past 3 days. He went to Columbus. The flight was 40 minutes. The car Douglas had arranged met him at the airport. The Columbus morning was gray and early, and the streets were still mostly quiet except for the people who had places to be before the city fully woke up, the hospital workers and the delivery people and the parents getting up early, because children are early risers whether the world is in crisis or not. He rode through those streets in the back of a car and looked out the window and tried to remember the last time he had been somewhere ordinary, not a resort, not a board meeting city, not a destination. Somewhere ordinary where people lived regular lives in regular houses with regular cars, and $8 meant something, and a Venmo request in the middle of the night was a plan. The hospital was the color of old paper. He walked through the main entrance and asked for Elena Chris at the desk, and the woman at the desk looked at him the way people look at someone who doesn't quite fit where they are, the way his face and his coat and whatever it was he projected didn't match the early morning energy of a Columbus hospital lobby, and he said he was a family friend, which was technically true in a way that was also technically a stretch, and he sat down to wait. Charlie was brought in by the neighbor at 7:15. He saw the child before the child saw him. Charlie was small for 8, not unhealthily small, just compact, the way some children are, like they are saving up their size for later. Charlie had a backpack with a picture of a planet on it, and was wearing mismatched socks, one striped, one solid red, and was holding the hand of the neighbor, a woman in her 60s with a kind face and tired eyes, and was looking around the hospital lobby with the particular alertness of a child who has been in hospital lobbies before and knows what they mean, and is trying to be brave about it. Their eyes met. Charlie stopped walking. He raised a hand, a small wave, and Charlie stared at him for a long moment, and then said to the neighbor, very quietly, but not quietly enough not to carry across the lobby, "That's the man from the phone." The neighbor looked at him with about 14 emotions happening at once, and he stood up and walked toward them slowly, the way you approach something that requires care, and he crouched down, so he was at Charlie's level, which was a thing he had never done in professional life, and felt strange and right simultaneously, and he said, "Hey, Charlie." Charlie said, "Hey." He said, "Your mom is going to be okay." Charlie said, "I know. They told me." He said, "She's really brave, your mom." Charlie looked at him steadily. Children that age have a way of looking at you that adults have mostly lost. Direct, evaluating, without the social padding that makes adults look at each other sideways. Charlie looked at him like Charlie was deciding something important. Then Charlie said, "She told me about you." He said, "Yeah?" Charlie said, "She said you were going to be famous one day." She said she could tell. Something shifted in his chest. Not a small shift, a tectonic one. He said, "When did she tell you that?" Charlie said, "She used to tell me stories." She said she met this man at the hospital where she used to volunteer, and he was sitting alone, and he had these eyes like he was going somewhere no one could see yet. She said she always wondered if he made it. He blinked. Charlie said, "Did you make it?" He said yes. Charlie nodded, satisfied, like a debt had been confirmed. They were let in to see Elena at 8:30 in the morning. He had not planned what to say. He had been on planes and in cars and in hospital lobbies for hours and had thought about many things, but had not planned a single word. Because some conversations can't be planned. Some conversations you have to walk into the way you walk into weather. Just open yourself up and let it happen and deal with whatever comes. Elena was awake. She was pale and tired in the way that people are after their bodies have done something violent and involuntary. But she was awake, and she was sitting up in a hospital bed, and she looked at him when he came through the door, and her face did something complicated. She did not look surprised. That was the thing. She looked like a woman who had sent $8 on Venmo and taught her 8-year-old child a script, and was now seeing, with a kind of deep and exhausted satisfaction, that the plan had worked. He stood at the foot of her bed. He said, "You remembered me." She said, "I never forgot you." He said, "I left a note." She said, "I know. I got it." She smiled just slightly, the kind of smile that cost something. She said it was a good note. He said, "I tried to find you." She said, "I know. You asked Rosalind at the desk. She told me." She said a young man in a terrible coat left a note for the volunteer with the cart. He laughed. It came out of him like something that had been compressed, something that had been waiting for a release point. He laughed and she laughed. And Charlie, standing in the doorway, looked between them with the expression of a child who understands that something important is happening between the adults, even if they cannot name what it is. He pulled the chair to the side of her bed and sat down. He said, "Tell me about Charlie." She told him. Not everything at once. The way people tell the important things. In layers, starting from the outside and working inward, giving you time to adjust to each new depth before they take you deeper. She had been sick for 3 years. The seizures had come on suddenly, the way these things do, a Tuesday that looked like every other Tuesday, and then something in her brain had misfired, and she had woken up on the floor of her kitchen, not knowing how long she had been there. The condition was manageable, but not curable. She had good months and bad months. She had learned to read the signs, learned to know when a bad stretch was coming, and when the signs were there she would make her preparations. She had a list. She had arrangements. And at the top of the list, the thing she did before anything else when she felt the warnings come, was to make sure Charlie's protocol was active. Charlie's protocol. He said, $8 on Venmo. She said, $8 on Venmo. He said, why $8? She said, because if you send $0, it looks like an accident. If you send 10, it looks too round. $8 looks like someone made a specific choice. $8 makes a person stop and think, why 8? And when a person stops and thinks why 8, they call to find out. She said she had tested it. She said she had sent her self-test requests from dummy accounts, and the $8 amount was the one that consistently triggered a callback. The ones she sent with other amounts got ignored or declined. $8 got curiosity. He stared at her. He said, you designed this. She said, I had to design something. I could not leave Charlie with nothing. He said, but my number, how did you have my number? She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, about 8 years ago, just after Charlie was born, she was at a conference in Columbus. She worked in healthcare administration now, had for many years, and a man had given a keynote address, and that man had been him, and she had recognized him immediately, that young man from the hospital waiting room 24 years minus 8 years ago, sitting there with a terrible coat, and the eyes like he was going somewhere no one could see yet. She said he had been on stage, and she had been in the audience, and the room had 300 people in it, and she had sat very still, and felt something she could not describe, some specific feeling of a circle closing. She said she had not approached him. She had gone home to baby Charlie, and she had thought about it, and she had decided she did not want to be a footnote in someone else's story. She had a life. She had Charlie. She had her work and her health, though the health had not yet started to get complicated. She had been happy. She had left it alone, but she had written down his number, not from the program. Speakers' numbers are never in programs. She had done what anyone does now. She had looked him up. It had not been hard to find a number that reached him, or reached someone who reached him, and she had written it in her address book, an actual paper address book, the kind nobody uses anymore. And she had thought, I will probably never use this. But she had written it anyway because she was someone who believed in having the thing before you needed it rather than needing it and not having it. And then 3 years ago, when the seizure started, and she was sitting with her lawyer drawing up documents and thinking about contingencies, she had thought about that number. She said she knew it was a long shot. She said she knew 24 years was a long time and people change, and she had no right to ask anything of anyone. And technically she was asking $8, which was nothing. Technically. Except it was the $8 that would make him call. He said, you save your own child's life with $8 in a psychology experiment. She said, I saved my child's life by remembering that some people are worth keeping in your address book. Charlie came and sat on the edge of the bed and leaned against Elena, and Elena put her arm around Charlie, and they both looked at him. The woman who had been 32 when she planned this, and the child who had executed the plan in the dark at 3 a.m, both of them looking at him with the same steady, evaluating eyes. And he thought, these two people are the most organized human beings I have ever encountered, and I have worked with some of the most organized people on earth. He said, what do you need? Elena said, I'm fine. He said, I did not ask if you were fine. I asked what you need. She looked at him for a long time. She said, Charlie needs a good school, a really good school. Charlie is... She looked at Charlie with the expression that parents say for the moments when they are about to say something enormous about their child in front of their child, something true and important. Charlie is exceptionally smart, like, in a way that the regular school does not know what to do with. Charlie reads at a level that I cannot even explain, without sounding like one of those parents who makes everything about their kid. But it is not just reading. It is everything. Charlie understands things. Big things. The kind of things that... And she stopped and smiled and said, you know what? Charlie has your eyes. He said, what? She said, not literally. But that look. That going somewhere nobody can see yet look. Charlie has it. And I have been terrified this whole time of what happens to a child like that if things... She stopped. He understood what she was not saying. He said, nothing is going to happen to you. She said, you don't know that. He said, I know that you are not doing this alone anymore. He said it plainly, the way you say things when you mean them completely, and you do not want the weight of what you mean to get lost in decoration. He said, I don't know what this looks like yet, and I am not going to make promises I haven't thought through, because that's not fair to you or to Charlie. But I am telling you that I came here this morning, and I am not leaving empty-handed. Charlie said, "What does that mean?" He looked at Charlie. He said, "It means your mom put $8 in the universe, and the universe is sending something back." Charlie considered this with the gravity of a philosopher, and then said, "That's a lot of return on investment." Elena burst out laughing. He burst out laughing. And in the gray Columbus morning, in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and something like relief, the three of them laughed together. And for a moment it was impossible to feel anything but the strange and specific joy of a plan that had worked, of an $8 bet on a stranger's goodness that had paid out, of a child who could talk about return on investment at 8 years old while wearing mismatched socks. He stayed in Columbus for 3 days, not in a hotel. Though Douglas had booked him one, he stayed because there was more to understand, and he was someone who did not act without understanding. He met with Elena's doctors. With Elena's permission, she insisted on being in a room for every conversation. She was not someone who surrendered her own narrative, and the doctors told him things he needed to hear about her condition, about what the good months looked like and what the hard ones looked like, about the medication that helped and the things that made it worse, about the statistical picture that was not terrible but was not nothing either. He met Charlie's teacher. That happened because on the second day, Charlie's school called about Charlie missing a day, and Elena asked Charlie if it was okay if he drove them to school in the morning. And Charlie said yes with the easy trust of a child who has decided you are safe. And he drove Charlie to school in the rental car and walked in with Charlie and ended up in the principal's office, not because Charlie was in trouble, but because the teacher, Miss Perkins, had been told by Charlie that a very important man was in the car and could she come out, and the principal had come instead. And one thing had led to another, and he had spent an hour in the school talking to the principal and the teacher and had walked away knowing 3 things. The first was that Charlie was, in fact, extraordinary. Not in the way parents sometimes believe their children are extraordinary, when they are really just ordinary in the beautiful, ordinary way that all children are. Actually extraordinary. The teacher had described it in the careful language of someone who did not want to overpromise, but who was also trying very hard not to underpromise. She said Charlie absorbed information the way some children absorb music, not just learning it, but integrating it, making it part of something larger, connecting things that other kids the same age could not yet see as related. She said Charlie's reading level was off the charts they used for school. She said Charlie had come to her after a science lesson 3 months ago and quietly told her that the textbook had an error in it. She had checked. The textbook had an error in it. The second thing he learned was that the school was underfunded. Not dramatically, not in the way that sometimes makes news. In the quiet, grinding, constant way that many good public schools are underfunded, where teachers by their own supplies and programs get cut, and the bright children get lost not because anyone failed them specifically, but because the system does not have the resources to find them and hold them. The third thing was that Charlie already knew what they wanted to do. He found this out not from the teacher, but from Charlie on the drive back to Elena's house that afternoon. When he asked what Charlie liked to learn about, expecting a single subject, expecting science or history or math, getting ready to respond the way you respond when a child tells you their favorite thing. Charlie said, everything. He said, what's your favorite kind of everything? Charlie said, I want to know how things work. Not just how they work like a machine, but why they work that way. Why things got made the way they did. Why some people invented things and other people didn't think to. Why some ideas came first and other ideas had to wait. I want to know the whole story of how everything we have got to be here. He drove in silence for a moment. Then he said, that's called the history of ideas. Charlie said, is that a subject? He said, at the right school, it's the whole curriculum. Charlie pressed their face against the car window and looked at the Columbus skyline passing by, which was not the most dramatic skyline in America, but was a skyline, was evident of all those ideas adding up into glass and steel, and said, tell me about the right school. So he told Charlie about the right school, not a specific one yet, because he had not done the research, because he was not someone who talked about things before he knew them well enough to stand behind them, but he told Charlie the idea of it. He talked about schools where the question is the point, where the teacher is less a deliverer of answers and more a companion in asking, where the curriculum bends toward the student rather than the student bending toward the curriculum. Charlie listened with the focused attention of someone doing very serious work. Then Charlie said, "And Mama can come." It was not a question. He said, "Mama is the whole point." Charlie nodded, settled, and went back to looking at the skyline. The third day was harder than the first two. The third day was when Elena told him the rest. Not the medical details. Those she had shared with the doctors, and she was fine with him knowing. The rest. The part that was not about seizures in school and clever Venmo strategies. The part that was about her. She had been married. She told him this in the kitchen of her house over coffee on his last morning in Columbus. With Charlie at school and the quiet of a house that was usually busy suddenly very present around them. She had been married for 4 years, and Charlie's father had been a good man and a bad husband, which she said with a lack of bitterness of someone who had been through bitterness already and come out the other side. He had not been cruel. He had not been dangerous. He had just been someone who loved the idea of a life more than the actual work of living it. And when the actual work arrived, in the form of a baby and a mortgage and a wife who was tired and a life that was messier than the idea of it, he had quietly, over the course of about 18 months, gone somewhere else. Not dramatically, not with a scene, just gradually, incrementally, until one day he was more absent than present, and then one day he was just absent. He said, "Does he know about your condition?" She said, "He knows." She said, "What does real mean?" He said, "It means I set up a foundation account for Charlie's education. It means I'd pay your medical costs, all of them, going forward, not as charity, not as a gift, but as me paying back the granola bar, which I have owed you for 24 years with interest." He said, "And it means I come back, not every week, not on a schedule that makes either of us feel trapped, but I come back because Charlie asked me what the right school is, and I want to be there when we figure that out together." Elena did not say anything for a long moment. Outside the kitchen window, a bird was doing something in the yard, hopping between patches of grass with a particular purposeful energy of a creature that has a plan. She said, "Why?" He said, "Because you saw me when I was sitting in a waiting room at 2 in the morning when I was 23 years old, and I was invisible, and you left me a granola bar." He said, "And 24 years later your 8-year-old child called me from the dark, and now I am sitting in your kitchen, and I feel more awake than I have felt in 4 months." He said, "I think that means something." She said, "It might mean you need better sleep hygiene." He said, "It might mean that." She said, "Or it might mean something." He said, "Yeah." They drank their coffee in the morning quiet, and the bird continued its work in the yard and somewhere across Columbus. Charlie was at school, asking questions that the textbook could not answer, looking at the world with eyes like someone going somewhere no one could see yet, and everything that was going to happen had not happened yet, which is the most important thing about a morning, that it is still before everything, that the day has not yet used up its possibilities. He flew back to New York. He sat in the plane and looked at his phone, and the $8 Venmo approval was still there in his history, confirmed, complete. He looked at it for a long time. $8. He had spent $8,000 on a bottle of wine at a dinner last year without thinking about it. He had written checks with more zeros than most people's annual income. He had moved money in amounts so large that they felt abstract, felt like math rather than money, felt like nothing at all. And $8 had kept him awake for 3 nights and driven him to Ohio and put him at a kitchen table with a woman who had not forgotten him when every reasonable version of the world would have had her forget him completely. He had Douglas start the paperwork. When he landed, the education fund was straightforward. He had done similar things for other causes, other children, other schools. The medical coverage was more complicated, but his legal team handled complicated things before breakfast. What he could not put in paperwork was the other thing, the coming back, the being available. Those things did not have a legal structure and did not need one. Those things ran on a different system than his normal life, ran on the system that had been powered by a granola bar 24 years ago and that had been running on low since, waiting, apparently, for this particular refueling. He called his therapist. He had not called her in 3 weeks. He had been going through a stretch, the divorce, the insomnia, the general low-grade feeling that he was very successful at a life he was no longer sure he wanted, where calling felt like admitting something he was not ready to admit. He called her now and told her everything, all of it. The phone at 3 in the morning and Charlie and the granola bar and the mismatched socks, and the bird in the yard, and the coffee, and the feeling of being awake. His therapist was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How do you feel right now?" He said, "Useful." She said, "Say more." He said, "I feel like I did something that mattered. Not that mattered in the way that making $1 billion matters," which is a kind of maturing that I am honestly starting to wonder about. Maturing in the way that a granola bar matters. Specific, direct. Here is a thing. Here is a person who needed it. Here is a thing going directly to the person. No complexity. No middle. No question about whether the impact is real. She said, "And when was the last time you felt that?" He did not answer right away. He looked out the plane window at the country scrolling by below him, the geometry of it, the fields and roads and towns that from up here looked like a pattern, and from down there were individual lives. And he said, "I'm not sure I've ever felt exactly that. Not even at the beginning. Even at the beginning, there was always the next thing to think about, the next level to reach, the next problem to solve." But Charlie asked me to tell him about the right school, and then just looking out the car window, he stopped. He said, there was no next level in that moment. It was just that moment. His therapist said, "I think you should write that down." He said, "I don't journal." She said, "I know. Write it down anyway." He got a legal pad from his bag. He was someone who still used legal pads, which people found anachronistic, which he found grounding, and he wrote down there was no next level. He looked at it for a moment, and then wrote underneath it, "What if that's the level?" He did not know exactly what that meant yet, but he felt it was true. The weeks that followed were not dramatic. This is important, because stories like this one are often told as if every moment is a revelation, as if the change is immediate and total and arrives with a musical score. Real change does not usually work that way. Real change is mostly administrative. Real change is paperwork and phone calls and scheduling and the grinding, ordinary work of actually doing the thing you said you would do. He had said he would help, and so he helped, and helping mostly looked like phone calls with Elena's medical team, and conversations with Douglas about structuring the education fund, and research, a significant amount of research, into schools, not just schools in Columbus, everywhere. He had a conversation with Elena in which he said he wanted to present options, and she had said, "I am not moving to New York." And he had said he was not asking her to move to New York. And she had said good, and the conversation had moved forward. He looked at programs, at boarding schools for the gifted, which Elena vetoed immediately and completely. She was not sending Charlie away. At accelerated day programs, at enrichment programs, at universities with early entrance provisions, at schools that had been built specifically for children who thought the way Charlie thought. He found one. It was in Columbus. Of course it was in Columbus, because the universe has a sense of humor that tends to operate locally. It was a small school, not famous, not the kind of place whose name you would recognize, but it had been built by a woman 20 years ago who had been exactly the kind of child Charlie was, who had sat through conventional education feeling simultaneously bored and lonely, and had spent her adulthood building the school she had needed. It was inquiry-based. It was cross-disciplinary. It believed, structurally and philosophically, that a child's questions were more important than the answers in the textbook, especially when a child had already found the error in the textbook. It also had a significant wait list. He called the founder. This is one of the privileges that money provides that he had always thought of as slightly embarrassing and now felt entirely comfortable using for the right reason. The privilege of the call going through. People return calls from his office. People clear schedules. He knew this and had always been ambivalent about it, and today was not ambivalent at all. The call went through and he told the founder about Charlie. And the founder was quiet in the way that educators are quiet when they recognize a specific kind of child being described to them. The founder said, "What does this child's curiosity look like?" He thought about Charlie in the car, face against the window, asking about the history of ideas. He told her. The founder said, "When can I meet them?" He said, "When it's good for you." The founder said, "Monday." He said he would be there. He went back to Columbus. He went back 4 times in 6 weeks, and each time the shape of what he was doing became a little clearer and a little less frightening. Not frightening in the way danger is frightening. Frightening in a way that caring about people is frightening, which is its own specific category of risk. The risk of being the person who shows up, of making yourself available, of letting things matter to you, when you have spent a significant portion of your life building systems to prevent things from maturing too much. On the second visit, he and Charlie went to the school. The founder met them at the door. She was a woman in her 50s with the kind of energy that certain educators have, a kind of compressed intensity that is really enthusiasm disciplined into patience, that has learned to slow down to the speed of a child without losing any of its heat. She shook Charlie's hand first, before she shook his, which was exactly the right move, and which Charlie noticed with the expression of someone checking a box. She took Charlie on a tour. He walked behind them and watched and did not speak much. He watched Charlie see the library, which was not organized by subject the way libraries usually are, but by question. Entire sections built around questions rather than topics. So instead of history, you had why did things happen the way they did? And instead of science, you had how does the world actually work? And instead of math, you had what is a language underneath everything. He watched Charlie stand very still in the middle of the library for a long moment, looking at the shelves, and then turn to the founder and say, "Did you build this?" The founder said, "I designed it. The students help maintain it every year. They decide where new books go based on what question they belong to." Charlie said, "What if a book belongs to more than one question?" The founder smiled. She said, "Then you write the question it belongs to on a little card and put the card in both places." Charlie looked back at the shelves. Charlie said, "I want to go here." The founder said, "I know." Charlie started at the school 3 weeks later. He was there for the first day. Not in the school, not inside. That would have been too much. That would have been inserting himself into a moment that belonged to Charlie and Elena. But in the parking lot, sitting in the rental car, watching the building, he was not sure what he was doing there exactly. He was not a parent. He was not a family member. He was a man who had received an $8 Venmo request at 3 in the morning and had, subsequently, become something that did not have a name yet in relation to these two people. Elena was there, inside, walking Charlie to classroom. He had driven them. That had been his role. Driver. He had driven them, and he had waited in the parking lot. And he was fine with that. He was more than fine with that. He had been in rooms full of very important people doing very important things, and had felt less of a participant in life than he did right now, sitting in a rental car in Columbus in the morning, waiting. Elena came out alone. She walked to the car and got in. She said, "They went straight to the library." He said, "Of course they did." She said, "They didn't even look back." He said, "Is that okay?" She said, "It's everything." She said, "When your child doesn't look back, that means they feel safe enough to go forward. That's all you're working for. That's the whole job." She said it with the satisfaction of someone who has been working towards something for a long time and has just seen the evidence that it is real. He drove her to her office. On the way, she said, "I want to know something." He said, "Ask." She said, "What does this look like to you? Not the fund and not the school. What does this look like? Us. This situation. Whatever this is." He thought about it. He drove 2 blocks and thought about it. He said, "I think it looks like the thing that happened because of the granola bar." He said, "I don't have a better word for it than that." He said, "I know what it's not. It's not charity, and it's not a project, and it's not me trying to buy the feeling of being a good person." He said, "I think it's just, you kept me in your address book for 24 years. That is an act of faith, and I want to be worth it. That's what it looks like to me." She was quiet. Then she said, "Okay, just okay," which was enormous. 3 months passed. Charlie thrived. This word, thrived, is used a lot in contexts where it doesn't fully apply, where it really means doing fine, improving, adjusting. In Charlie's case, it was literal. The child who had been politely tolerated by a conventional school bloomed in a way that even the founder, who had seen many children find their environment, said she had rarely seen before. Charlie moved through the inquiry-based curriculum like water finding its way through a new landscape, finding every channel, going everywhere at once and somehow arriving at depth in all directions. The teacher started saying Charlie's name in their staff meetings not as a challenge to solve, but as a source of energy, a reminder of why they had built the place. He heard about all of this on the phone. He called on Tuesday evenings, which had become the established time without anyone establishing it. It had simply emerged as the natural rhythm, the way these things do when people are paying attention to each other. He called at 7 and spoke to Charlie for the first 20 minutes about school and ideas, and whatever Charlie was currently reading or wondering about. which ranged widely, and then he spoke to Elena for however long she had. Sometimes 20 minutes, sometimes an hour and a half. Once, 3 hours, because they had started talking about something, and neither of them could find a good place to stop, and by the time they did, it was past midnight, and he had an early board meeting, and he had not cared at all. He realized, around month 3, that he was looking forward to Tuesday evenings more than anything else in his week. He realized this on a Wednesday morning, sitting in his penthouse looking at the legal pad where he had written there was no next level, and what if that's a level? Looking at it the way you look at something you wrote while you were trying to understand something, and now, 3 months later, you understand it well enough to read it differently. He called his therapist on Wednesday morning. He said, "I think I understand the legal pad now." She said, "Tell me." He said, "I have been living at the next level for 20 years. Always the next thing. Always the bigger version. More money, more companies, more square footage, more altitude on the flights. And every time I reached the next level, it turned out that it was just a platform for the level after that. There was never a level that was just itself. There was never a thing that was just the thing." She said, "And now?" He said, "Tuesday evenings are just Tuesday evenings." She said, "What changed?" He said, "I think someone kept me in their address book." She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to think about it before you answer." He said, "Okay." She said, "What are you afraid of?" He said, "That is a very broad question." She said, "I know. What are you afraid of right now, specifically?" He thought about Tuesday evenings. He thought about Charlie's voice on the phone, telling him about the library and the books and the history of ideas and the question that a book belonged to. He thought about Elena's voice later in the call, talking about her work and her health and the things she was thinking about, the quality of her voice when she was tired and the quality when she was not, which he had learned to distinguish. He thought about Columbus, about how many times he had flown over Ohio without looking down. He said, "I'm afraid that I'm the wrong side for this." He said, "I'm afraid that what I am, what I become, is too big for what is actually good here." He said, "I'm afraid that Charlie and Elena have this beautiful, specific, small thing, and I am going to come in at my normal scale and ruin the proportions of it." His therapist said, "What would it look like to come in at a different scale?" He said, "I don't know. I've only ever had one scale." She said, "I think you might have found a second one. I think Tuesday evenings might be the second one." He sat with that. He said, "I don't know what to do with that." She said, "I think you do. I think you've been doing it for 3 months. He looked at the legal pad. What if that's a level? He flew to Columbus that Friday. Not because anything was wrong. Not because Elena's health had spiked. Not because Charlie needed something specific. Not because there was a problem to solve. He flew to Columbus because it was Friday and there was nowhere else he wanted to be, and he had not, in his adult life, made many decisions on that basis alone, and he thought it was time to start. He texted Elena first. He said, "I'm going to be in Columbus this weekend. No agenda. If you're around and you want company, I'll be around." She texted back, "We're going to the farmer's market Saturday morning. Charlie wants to look at the vegetable section for a project on food systems. You're welcome." He stared at the text for a moment. A farmer's market. Columbus on a Saturday morning. Looking at vegetables for a school project on food systems. He texted back, "What time?" She said, 9. He said, "I'll bring coffee." She said, "Charlie takes hot chocolate." He said, "Noted." The farmer's market was held in a large parking lot that the city had converted on Saturday mornings, and it smelled of fresh bread and something green and a particular quality of October air in the Midwest, which has a crispness that is different from the crispness of other places, something about the flatness of the land that lets the air move without obstruction. He arrived at 8:50 with coffee and hot chocolate and found them by the vegetable stands, Charlie holding a notebook, an actual paper notebook, Elena's influence clearly, and writing things down with the seriousness of a researcher. Charlie looked up when he arrived. Charlie said, "Do you know what a food desert is?" He said, "Yes." Charlie said, "There's one 4 blocks from our house." He said, "I know." Charlie said, "I want to fix it." He said, "Tell me how." Charlie spent the next 45 minutes telling him, in the detailed and slightly unfiltered way of a child who has been thinking about something for a while and has not yet learned to edit for the audience, how the food system in their neighborhood could be improved. It involved a community garden and a mobile market and a partnership with the school and a grant from the city, and at some point Charlie said, and we would need like $30,000 to start, but I think we could get it if we applied for the right things. He looked at Elena. Elena was looking at a bunch of kale with an expression that was trying very hard to be neutral. He said, Charlie, have you talked to anyone at the school about this? Charlie said, the project teacher said it was a good idea, but the budget for field projects is $400, so it would have to be something we do outside school. He said, what if I could connect you with someone who works on urban food access? Charlie said, you know someone who does that? He said, I know a lot of people. Charlie said, of course you do. The hot chocolate was almost gone, and the farmer's market was getting busier, and Elena had bought kale and a small pumpkin and was carrying them in a cloth bag, and the three of them were walking between the stands, not on any particular route, just moving through the Saturday morning at the pace of people with nowhere specific to be, and he thought about how he had scheduled his life for 20 years in 15-minute increments, and what it felt like to walk at a pace set by an 8-year-old, carrying a research notebook. It felt, he thought, like something he should have found years ago. The thing about people who build big things from nothing is that they are often very bad at small things, not because they're selfish, not because they don't care, but because the habits of mind that build companies, the scale, the forward projection, the always more, are not the habits of mind that make you good at being present. They run on different fuel. And you can have all the success in the world and still walk through a Saturday morning farmer's market as a stranger to your own life. He was not doing that today. Today he was in it. He was in the market in the October air and the hot chocolate gone cold in his hand, and Charlie's running commentary on the food system, and Elena's occasional interjection, and the smell of bread from a stand they had walked past twice already. Charlie pulled him toward the bread stand. Charlie said, can we get some? He said, obviously. They ate bread standing up at the edge of the market, 3 of them, tearing pieces from a loaf of sourdough, and the bread was very good and warm, and the morning was very October, and he thought, this is the level. This is the level that has always been here, and I have been flying over it. He told Elena that night. She had made dinner, a real dinner, the kind that takes time and involves multiple burners and fills a house with the kind of warmth that is not about temperature, and Charlie had fallen asleep on the couch reading, the book still open on their chest, and they were at the kitchen table with wine, her wine, the kind of wine that does not need to be expensive to be exactly right for the moment, and he told her what he had been thinking at the market. She listened the way she listened, completely, without filling the pauses, which was a quality he had noticed in very few people and valued enormously. When he finished, she said, I've been thinking something similar. He said, yeah? She said, I've been thinking about what I want. Not what Charlie needs, not what the situation requires, not what makes sense. What I want. She said, I haven't thought about that in a while. There was a stretch where Charlie was a whole thing, where Charlie's well-being was the only variable that counted. And that was right. That was the right call. That is what you do when you're someone's parent. But I'm also someone outside of being someone's parent. And I am starting to remember that. He said, what do you want? She said, I want to be well. She said it plainly, the way she said most important things. She said, I want the medicine to keep working, and the bad months to keep being countable, and the good months to keep being more. She said, I want Charlie to grow up with the resources to become whatever Charlie is becoming. She said, I want Tuesday evenings. He said, I want Tuesday evenings too. She looked at him. She said, this is a very strange situation. He said, it is. She said, a billionaire and a wrong number and an $8 Venmo request. He said, and a granola bar. She said, and a granola bar. Charlie stirred on the couch, and they both went quiet, the way adults go quiet when a sleeping child moves, holding their breath for a moment. And then Charlie settled back into sleep, and the book slid off the chest onto the cushion, and they both exhaled. He said, can I tell you something? She said, always. He said, when I first came here the second or third day, I thought about what this looked like. I thought about how I would tell this story to my board, to Douglas, to anyone, and I kept framing it as philanthropy, as me helping, as the powerful person doing the thing for the person who needed it. And then I was at the kitchen table with you, and Charlie was talking about return on investment. And I laughed, and I thought, that framing is completely wrong. She said, What's the right framing? He said, I don't know yet, but it doesn't start with me. It starts with you. You are the one who remembered. You are the one who planned. You are the one who designed an $8 psychology experiment and trusted that a stranger from a waiting room 24 years ago was worth keeping in an address book. You did all of that. I just answered the phone. She said, you could have not answered. He said, I almost didn't. She said, but you did. He said, something made me. She said, what? He said, I think I was awake because I was lonely, and I was lonely because I have forgotten that there is a version of life that has more in it than I have been putting in it. And when the phone rang at 3 a.m. with an $8 Venmo request, something that had been asleep for a while woke up and said, this is it. This is the thing you have been missing. Answer. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I didn't put your number in my address book to be saved by you. He said, I know. She said, I put it there because I believed you were going to be someone who mattered, and I wanted the connection to exist. Not for Charlie. Not for me. Just because I thought you were real, and real things should have a thread between them even when they're far apart. He said, that is the most generous thing anyone has ever said about why they kept my phone number. She said, it's the most true thing. The wine was finished and the candles she had lit. Because she was someone who lit candles at dinner, even when dinner was ordinary, a habit she had because she believed that ordinary things deserve ceremony, were getting low. And the house was very warm in the specific way of a house that has been lived in for a long time by people who care about it. And Charlie was asleep on the couch, and outside the Columbus night was very still and very dark and very far from Manhattan in every way that counted. He flew back to New York on Sunday. He looked different when he came back. Douglas noticed first. Douglas said, you look different. He said the way assistants who have worked for someone for 11 years say things, which is directly and without apology, because 11 years earns you that. He said, do I? Douglas said, yeah. What happened in Columbus? He said, I think I remembered something. Douglas said, what? He said, what I was like before I was good at this. Douglas looked at him for a long moment, and then said, do you need me to clear anything on Tuesday evenings? He said, you noticed? Douglas said, I've been with you for 11 years. He said, clear Tuesday evenings. Permanently. Douglas made a note. He went back to his legal pad. He wrote below what that's a level. He wrote, what if the level is a child falling asleep on a couch with a book on their chest, and wine that doesn't need to be expensive and candles because ordinary things deserve ceremony? He looked at it for a while. Then he wrote, what would it take to live there? He spent the next 6 weeks thinking about that question. Not just thinking, researching. He did what he did with every important problem, which was to treat it with the seriousness it deserved, to gather information, to understand the landscape before committing to a direction. He talked to people who had made changes like the one he was considering. Not dramatic changes. Not the people who had sold everything and moved to farms, which was always the story people told when they talked about changing your life, and which almost never ended the way the story promised. He talked to people who had reoriented, who had kept what they built but changed where they put their attention, who had found a level that was just a level and had chosen to live there without abandoning the rest. He talked to his father. His father was 73 and lived in Cincinnati, and they talked on the phone once a week and had for years, a conversation that was usually about nothing specific, but was really about maintaining the thread. And he called his father on a Tuesday before the Columbus call and told him everything. His father listened the way his father always listened, which was with kind of amused gravity, as if he was perpetually both moved by and slightly unsurprised by whatever you brought him. His father said, you know what your grandmother used to say? He said, tell me. His father said, she used to say that money is like water. It takes the shape of whatever you put it in. She said, the question is never how much water you have. The question is what container you've chosen. He said, I need a bigger container. His father said, son, you need a different shaped one. He called Elena on Tuesday at 7. Charlie was doing homework. At school, they did not have homework in the traditional sense. They had self-directed inquiry that happened to often look like research and writing, but was structured around a question Charlie had chosen. And so the call started with Elena, and then Charlie joined from the table where the homework that was not homework was spread out. Charlie said, I have a question. He said, always. Charlie said, what is the most important thing you ever did? He said, give me a second. He thought about it, not in the way people pause for effect. Actually thought about it. The companies, the deals, the decisions that had moved markets, the check he had written for the school, the education fund, the medical coverage. He thought about all of it. Then he said, I answered a phone call. Charlie said, that's small. He said, the smallest things are usually the most important. Charlie said, my teacher says that. He said, your teacher is right. Charlie said, she says that history is mostly made of small moments that everyone forgets to write down, and the big moments are just the small moments that somebody happened to notice. He said, I want to meet your teacher. Charlie said, she already knows who you are. She says everyone who teaches kids should know who fund their school. He said, Charlie, I want you to know something. Charlie said, what? He said, funding the school was easy. Easy in the sense that I had the money and I could do it. He said, but something is coming that is going to be harder than that, and I want you to hear it from me before it happens. Charlie said, what's coming? He said, I am thinking about moving to Columbus. There was a long pause. Not a bad pause. A processing pause. The kind of pause that an exceptionally intelligent 8-year-old makes when they are taking a large piece of information and sorting through its implications at a speed that most adults cannot match. Then Charlie said, does Mama know? He said, not yet. I'm going to talk to her after. Charlie said, are you moving because of us or because of you? He said, both. Charlie said, that's the right answer. He said, yeah. Charlie said, Mama always says decisions should be good for both people or they're not actually good decisions. He said, Mama is very smart. Charlie said, I know. He talked to Elena after, when Charlie had gone back to the homework that was not homework, and he told her what he had told Charlie. She did not respond immediately. She said, tell me what that looks like. He said, I don't know exactly. I know I want to keep the company. Most of it. I have people who can run most of it. I've been running it at a scale that I chose for reasons that made sense 20 years ago, and I'm not sure they make sense now. He said, I want to be here on Tuesday evenings and Saturday farmers markets, and I want to be in the parking lot when there's a first day, and I want to be in the kitchen when there's a dinner. He said, I want to be available. She said, that word again. He said, it's the right word. She said, I need you to know something. He said, tell me. She said, I am not easy. She said it plainly, without apology, which was the way she said everything. She said, my health is unpredictable. Charlie is a lot. I work full-time, and my work matters to me, and I am not going to reshape my life around someone else's presence, no matter how much I come to value that presence. She said, I am also 39 years old with a neurological condition, and an 8-year-old, and a house that needs a new water heater, and a car that is 7 years old, and I am not your project. He said, I know. She said, do you? He said, you are not my project. You are. He paused. He said, you are the person who left me the granola bar. You are the person who believed I was going somewhere before I knew where I was going. You are the person who put me in your address book for 24 years, not because you needed anything from me, but because you thought the connection was worth keeping. He said, I want to be worth keeping back. She said, and if this gets complicated. He said, when has it not been complicated? She made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sigh and was somehow both. She said, I'll think about it. He said, that's all I'm asking. She said, no, it's not. He said, you're right. It's not. They were quiet for a moment. Then she said, I got the granola bar from a donation bin. It wasn't even mine to give. Someone had left a box of granola bars at the volunteer desk with a note that said for the people sitting up late. He said, what? She said, I didn't buy it. I just delivered it. Someone else left the box. He said, and you never knew who. She said, never knew who. He said, that's the best thing I've ever heard. She said, why? He said, because it means the kindness started somewhere else, and it just kept moving. It went from some anonymous person to you to me to Charlie. He said, the granola bar is still moving. She said, that's a lot for a granola bar. He said, it was a very good granola bar. She laughed. It was the Rayall laugh, not the careful one. The one that was unguarded and full and came without thinking. The one that was her when she was not managing anything. when there was nothing to manage because it was just a phone and Tuesday evening, and the sound of Charlie at the table doing homework that was not homework. He sat in his penthouse and held the phone and listened to her laughing and looked at the legal pad. What would it take to live there? He wrote courage. He wrote the specific courage of someone who has gotten very good at one kind of life deciding to get good at a different kind. He wrote available. He circled it. He made the announcement to his board 6 weeks later. Not a retirement. Not a resignation. A reorientation, which is a word that some of his board members received well, and some did not, which was expected, which was fine. He was not relinquishing control of the company. He was restructuring his involvement. He was stepping back from day-to-day operations and moving into a strategic role that would allow him to work from anywhere, which in his case meant Columbus, Ohio. One of his board members said, "Columbus." He said, "Columbus." The board member said, "What's in Columbus?" He said, "Everything." The board member looked at him for a moment and then said, "Are you sure about this?" He said, "I'm very sure." The board member said, "You know this is going to be a story." He said, "The press will have things to say." He said, "Let them." The board member said, "It's a big change." He said, "It's a small change. It's a very small, specific change that happens to have large implications." He said, "I am relocating to Columbus, Ohio. I am continuing to run this company strategically. And I am choosing, for the first time in a very long time, to live at the level that is just a level." The board member looked at him without understanding. He said, "That's okay. You don't have to understand it. You just have to trust that I know what I'm doing." He moved to Columbus in February, not to Elena's house. That would have been too much, too fast. And also her water heater had finally given out completely, and the timing was not right on multiple levels. He got a place 3 neighborhoods away. A real house, not a penthouse. He had had enough of altitude, enough of being above things. A house with a yard and rooms that had histories he had not made. A house that needed some work, which he took as a good sign, because things that need work are things that you can participate in, and he wanted to participate. Charlie helped him unpack. This was Elena's idea. She had said, "Charlie has opinions about how spaces should be organized." And she was right. Charlie absolutely had opinions, and those opinions were detailed and specific, and came with reasoning. And by the end of the afternoon, the living room was arranged in a way that Charlie had determined was optimal for both conversation and quiet, which apparently were not incompatible if you thought about it properly. And he had not thought about it properly until Charlie explained it. He looked at his living room. He said, "Charlie, you should consider a career in architecture." Charlie said, "I'm considering 12 careers right now. Architecture is number 4. He said, "What are 1 through 3? Charlie said, "Ecologist, historian of science, and either a diplomat or chef. I haven't decided." He said, "Not many people could be both." Charlie said, "Anthony Bourdain kind of was." He stared at the child. He said, "Where did you learn about Anthony Bourdain?" Charlie said, "The library has a section under question, what does it mean to really understand a place? And his books are there." He said, "Of course they are." He made dinner that night. Not well. He was not a good cook. Had never had to be. Had chefs his entire adult life. Had spent decades surrounded by people whose job it was to make sure food appeared in front of him without him having to think about it. He made pasta. He followed the directions on the box of the pasta and made a sauce from a jar, which he heated on the stove, which was already progress. He made garlic bread under broiler and only slightly burned one side. Elena brought wine. Charlie brought a book, which was unnecessary but also completely expected. They ate at the kitchen table of his new house in Columbus, which had the particular echoing quality of space that had not yet accumulated the softness of living. And the pasta was fine, and the jar sauce was fine, and the slightly burned garlic bread was fine. And Charlie read 3 pages of the book between bites of pasta and pointed out twice that the sauce needed something, but did not say what, which was 8-year-old, for I know the answer. "But I want you to figure it out." He said, "Salt?" Charlie said, "Basil." He said, "I don't have basil." Charlie said, "You will need to get basil." He said, "I will get basil." He got basil. He got basil and a lot of other things. Because February in a new house in the city, you are learning, means you discover continuously what you do not have. He got basil and a good can opener and a set of dishes that were not the ones that cost more than a car, just dishes. The kind you pick because they're the right size and the right weight, and curtains that he chose badly and replaced, and a second-hand lamp that Charlie had selected from an estate sale. They went to one Saturday morning in March, when Columbus was starting to shake off winter, and the light was returning in that specific way of Midwestern spring, which is less gradual, warming, and more a sudden decision that spring might as well happen. He settled. This is different from arriving. Arriving is a single moment. You are there. You are not. Settling is a process, a long negotiation between yourself and a place. The gradual accumulation of routines and landmarks, and a kind of knowledge that is not in any book. The knowledge of which coffee shop is too loud on Sunday mornings, and which street has the best light at this time of year, and how long it takes to drive to school when you are not rushing and when you are. He learned Columbus. He walked it. He drove it. He went to the farmer's market every Saturday that Elena and Charlie went, which was most Saturdays, and he got better at identifying vegetables, which Charlie considered an important life skill and which he was beginning to agree with. He went to Charlie's school events. Not the big ones, not the performances that parents mark on the calendar in September. The small ones. The ones where Charlie's class presented their inquiry projects to each other and to the few adults who showed up, which was sometimes no adults other than him and Elena, and occasionally the founder, who came to everything because she believed in bearing witness. Charlie presented the food systems project in April. The project had grown from the conversation at the farmer's market into something substantial, a detailed proposal for a community garden partnership between the school, the local food bank, and 2 neighborhood organizations, with projected cost and a funding timeline and a presentation that Charlie had given to an actual city council member the week before. He had arranged a city council meeting, which had required phone calls and navigation of Columbus City bureaucracy that reminded him that all bureaucracies are the same underneath the surface, and the trick to all of them is the same, which is patience and a clear ask. The city council member had been skeptical initially, and then had not been. Charlie had presented the proposal for 12 minutes and answered questions for 8 minutes, and the city council member had said, at the end, "How old are you?" And Charlie had said 8, and the city council member had said 8, and Charlie had said yes. Is that relevant to whether the proposal is good? And the city council member had laughed and said, no, it is not. The project got a small city grant. Not enough to do everything. Never enough to do everything. That was the nature of grants, the nature of public funding, the nature of caring about something that the world has not yet fully agreed is a priority. But enough to start. Enough for the first phase, which was the community garden, which would happen over the summer, which Charlie was already planning with a level of detail that the school's project teacher had compared, privately, to the planning he had seen from graduate students. He told Charlie this. Charlie said, I know. He said, that doesn't bother you? Charlie said, why would it bother me? I'm supposed to be planning at a graduate student level, so that when I'm a graduate student, I can plan at a higher level. She said that's called compounding. He said, where did you learn about compounding? Charlie said, I read about it in a book about your company. He said, there are books about my company. Charlie said, there are several. You should read them. He said, are they accurate? Charlie thought for a moment and then said, the financial parts seem right, but the parts about what you're like as a person are wrong. He said, how so? Charlie said, they make you sound like you only care about money. But you don't. You care about money, but you also care about basil. He stared at Charlie. He said, write that down. Charlie said, I already did. Spring moved into summer. The community garden went in. Charlie's school organized the planting days as field experiences. The whole school, all the children, coming out on weekends in groups to plant and weed and water and learn in the most direct possible way that food does not emerge from a store, but from the ground, from seeds and time and attention. He went to every planting day. He wore old clothes that he had bought specifically for the occasion, because he did not own old clothes, had replaced his wardrobe so many times over the years that there was nothing in it with history, and he got dirt on his hands and on those old clothes, and he planted things. He was not a good gardener. He was a terrible gardener. He had the instinct, developed over decades of dealing with very large problems, to do things too decisively and at the wrong time, to plant things that needed more room than he gave them, to water things either too much or not enough. Charlie corrected him continuously and without mercy, because Charlie had read 3 books on urban gardening and did not believe in softening the truth when the truth was standing right there being wrong about soil depth. Elena came on some planting days, and not others. Her health that spring was in a good stretch, which was felt by everyone without being spoken. The way good health is, when you have learned to pay attention to it, present and warm, and not taken for granted. She was working on a project at her job that she was excited about, a restructuring of a community health program that would improve access for families in 3 neighborhoods. And she talked about it with the particular energy of someone who has found the work that matches the shape of their mind. He listened. He was getting better at listening. Not that he had been bad at it before. He had built a company on being good at listening, had developed the skill deliberately, had practiced it. But the listening he had done in conference rooms and board meetings was strategic listening. Listening for information you needed. Listening to find the opening or the problem or the insight that would let you act. This was different. This was listening because the person speaking was interesting, and you wanted to know what they were thinking, and there was no action required at the end of it, no decision to be made, no problem to solve. Just the pleasure of following a mind that was interesting to follow. He told her this one evening in June. They were on his back porch, which had a small table and 2 chairs and a view of the yard, which was not a remarkable yard, but was his yard, and the summer evening was doing what summer evenings in Columbus do, which is settle slowly and warmly into itself, like a thing that has earned its rest. He said, "I've been thinking about listening." She said, "Tell me." He said, "I think I have spent most of my life listening for something, not to something. Like I was always waiting for the piece of information I needed so I could do the thing I was going to do." He said, "But with you, I am just listening. And I am starting to think that is a different activity than the other thing." She said, "It is?" He said, "It feels like rest." She said, "That's because it is." He said, "How did you learn to do it?" She said, "Charlie." She said, "When you have a child like Charlie, you learn very quickly to just listen, because if you start listening for something, you miss everything. Charlie doesn't give you the one useful thing. Charlie gives you everything. And the useful thing is somewhere in the everything, and you only find it by letting it all come." He said, "How do you know when you found it?" She said, "You know because something in you goes quiet." He said, "Like tonight." She said, "Like tonight." Summer became fall. Charlie turned 9 in September. The birthday party was at the community garden, which was producing by then tomatoes and herbs and 3 varieties of squash and 1 very ambitious watermelon that had come in smaller than anyone had hoped but sweeter than expected, which Charlie said was a lesson in the difference between ambition and outcome that should be taught in schools. He had asked Charlie, a month before the birthday, what they wanted. Charlie had said, "I want to have everyone at the garden, and I want there to be food from the garden, and I want you to give a speech." He said, "About what?" Charlie said, "About the wrong number." He said, "You know that story?" Charlie said, "Mama told me when I was old enough." She said, "I should know why I know how to send a Venmo request." She said there are things a child should understand about where they came from. She said the story starts with granola bar, and it is still going. He said, "And you wanted to tell it at your birthday party." Charlie said, "You tell it better than Mama does. Also she cries." He said, "I might cry." Charlie said, "I know. That's okay. The people at my school say that when adults cry at birthdays, it means the birthday was a good one." He told the story. He stood in the community garden on a September afternoon with tomato plants behind him and 9-year-olds and their parents in front of him, and Charlie sitting cross-legged on the ground, looking up at him with an expression that had a little bit of everything in it. And he told the story. He told it the way he had learned to tell the stories that mattered, which was plainly and in order, without dressing it up or drawing it out, letting the weight of it come from the facts rather than from performance. He said there was a man. He said he was sitting in a hospital waiting room at 2 in the morning when he was 23 years old, and he was invisible. He said a woman came through a cart, and she left him a granola bar without asking. He said 24 years later, that same woman's child called him at 3 in the morning from the dark, and he answered, and the thing that had started with a granola bar was still going. He paused. He said, "I want to tell you something about small things, because you are young enough to still believe that small things matter, and the world is going to spend a lot of time trying to convince you that they don't. The world is going to tell you that what matters is the big things, the big jobs and the big money and the big decisions. And I know something about the big things because I have had a lot of them. He said, but I am standing here today because of a granola bar. I am standing in this garden because of $8 on Venmo. I am standing next to this child. He looked at Charlie because someone believed it was worth keeping a phone number for 24 years. And none of those things are big. All of them changed everything. He looked at Charlie. He said, "Happy birthday." Charlie said, "Thank you." Then, very quietly, so that only he could hear, Charlie said, "You made it." He said, "Yeah." Charlie said, "She always knew you would." He looked over at Elena, who was, as predicted, crying. She did not look embarrassed about it. She looked like a woman who had spent 3 years making backup plans for the worst and had arrived at a birthday party in a community garden she had watched her child build. And the cry was not sadness. It was a specific physical response to an amount of relief and gratitude and love that the body does not have any other way to express. He looked at her for a long moment. She looked back. He thought about the hospital waiting room and the terrible coat and the cart and the granola bar. He thought about the diner in Cincinnati where she hadn't been. He thought about the conference where she had recognized him from across a room and had gone home to baby Charlie and had written down a number. He thought about the address book. He had seen it by now on the kitchen counter of her house, a real paper address book, the kind you bought at a stationery store, worn at the corners and his number in it, in her handwriting, on a page near the back with nothing around it, just his number, kept like a seed kept for a season that had not yet come. He thought about February and basil and the slightly burned garlic bread and the community garden and the estate sale lamp and Charlie choosing how the furniture should be arranged in Tuesday evenings and the farmer's market and the October air and the legal pad and what if that's the level? He thought about how 400 miles and 3 in the morning and $8 had crossed 24 years to arrive at this garden this September afternoon, this birthday, this child who was 9 years old and planning 12 careers, and had already produced a city-funded food systems initiative and could talk about Anthony Bourdain and return on investment and the difference between ambition and outcome. He thought, I almost went back to sleep. And then he stopped thinking and just stood in the garden with the September light and the tomato plants and the slightly too small watermelon and the 9-year-old and the woman who had remembered him, and he felt, in his chest, the particular quality of being exactly where you are supposed to be, which is the most rare and valuable thing that a life can produce, rarer than any amount of money, rarer than any level of success, the thing that all the next levels are supposed to be working toward, and almost never reach. He was there. He was there. There are people in this world, and you know who they are. You have met one or two in your life. They are not common, but they exist who carry other people. Not dramatically, not loudly, not in a way that gets written about. They just carry you. They put you in their address book. They leave you a granola bar. They teach their child to send $8 on Venmo in the middle of the night because they believe, even when belief is irrational, that the connection is worth keeping and the person on the other end is worth calling. Elena Chris was one of those people. He knew, now, that he had always been one too, or had been, at the beginning, before the money and the altitude had muffled it. He had been someone who answered. He had been someone who called back. He had been, at 23 in a waiting room in a terrible coat, someone that a stranger could look at and think, that person's going somewhere. And the somewhere matters, and the connection is worth keeping. He had just forgotten for a while. The forgetting happens. It is not a moral failure. It is the ordinary accumulation of a life lived at speed, where the next level is always just ahead, and the level you are standing on becomes invisible because you are always looking up. The forgetting happens, and then sometimes, if you are very lucky, at 3 in the morning, your phone makes a sound. He lay awake sometimes now in his Columbus house and listened to the quiet, not the New York quiet, which was never really quiet, which was always the hum of the city below. The Columbus quiet, which was more complete, which was a quiet city that had gone to sleep in the straightforward way of places that have made their peace with their own ordinariness. He lay awake sometimes and thought about the 47 years and where they had taken him and where they had brought him back to, and it did not feel like failure. It did not feel like retreat. It felt like the specific correction that a life makes when it finally gets honest about itself. He thought about Charlie, asleep 2 neighborhoods away with a book, probably still open on the chest, Dreaming, he imagined, in the organized and curious way of a child who had decided to understand everything and was working through the list systematically, one question at a time. He thought about Elena in her house with the water heater that still worked and the address book on the kitchen counter, managing the good stretch with the quiet gratitude of someone who had learned not to take the good stretches for granted, who had learned to inhabit them fully because she knew they were the point. He thought about how the world is full of granola bars that have not yet been delivered. He thought about how many people are sitting in waiting rooms at 2 in the morning in terrible coats, invisible, and how the difference between them staying invisible and being seen is usually nothing more than someone deciding to push the cart their direction. He thought about the $8 Venmo request still in his history. Approved, complete, $8. The return on investment, as Charlie would say, had been incalculable. He had built companies. He had moved markets. He had made decisions that had changed the economic landscape of whole sectors. He had done all of it, had the papers to prove it, had the accounts and Forbes listings and the boardrooms and the penthouse he had left behind. All of that was true and all of that was real, and none of it, not one single bit of it, had come close to what had happened when he had put his thumb over a phone number at 3 in the morning and felt, without being able to say why, that he should press call. He pressed call. The phone rang twice. On the third ring, a child started crying. And everything every careful, constructed, altitude-seeking, next-level, unreachable thing came back to Earth, which is where it had always wanted to be, which is where everything wants to be in the end. Down here, in the garden, with the basil, with the mismatched socks, with the slightly burned garlic bread, and the wine that doesn't need to be expensive, and the candles, because ordinary things deserve ceremony, and the child who falls asleep with a book on their chest, and the address book on the kitchen counter with a number in it kept for a season that had not yet come, with the granola bar, still moving, still moving. There's a thing that happens to people when they have lived long enough and built enough and lost enough and come back from enough. A thing that is not wisdom exactly, not the packaged kind, not the kind that comes with aphorisms and speaking fees. A thing that is more like a settling, the way sediment settles in water. When the water finally goes still, all the particles that have been suspended by the motion of a busy life, the ambitions, the fears, the next levels, the carefully constructed distance from things that could hurt you, they settle. And what is left when they settle is the clear water at the bottom, which is what you were always made of, which was always there. He was made of clear water. He had always been made of clear water. He had just been moving too fast to see it. The wrong number had stopped him long enough to go still. And in the still water, he had seen everything. He had seen a child named Charlie with mismatched socks and 12 career plans and a vision of the world as a problem worth solving. A child who had sat in the dark at 3 in the morning and done the bravest and most precise thing that an 8-year-old had ever done, which was to execute a plan that their mother had made and trusted that a stranger would be worth executing it for. He had seen a woman who had carried a phone number for 24 years, not because she was waiting to be saved, but because she believed in maintaining the threads that connect real things, who had planned for the worst with the organized grace of someone who has made peace with uncertainty and refused to let that uncertainty define the size of their love. He had seen himself, not the version he had built, the version he had been before the building. The 23-year-old in the terrible coat in the waiting room who had eaten a granola bar in the dark and felt, for the first time in a very long time, that the world was not entirely indifferent to him. That version had been the true one. He was getting back to it, not backward. You never go backward. The years between who you were and who you became are part of you. They are yours. They cannot be returned or denied. But the arc of a life, if you are paying attention, if you are honest, if you answer when it rings, the arc of a life bends back toward the clear water, toward the specific, toward the things that are just themselves and nothing else, toward the granola bar. He was almost there. Charlie's Food Systems project ran through the following spring. The community garden produced through the frost. They had planted cold-tolerant varieties in August, which had been Charlie's idea and which had required a detailed argument with the garden coordinator who had thought late planting was inadvisable and who had been proven wrong by the November kale, which was extraordinary, and which Charlie had presented at a school assembly as evidence that conventional wisdom should always be tested against specific conditions. He had been at the assembly. He had been at most things by then, not intrusively. Elena was careful about this, and so was he. There were rules they had developed without ever writing them down. The rules of two adults who respect each other's complexity and have learned to negotiate space without turning it into territory. He was at things that he had been invited to, and he was not at things where his presence was not the point. He was learning the difference, which is not always obvious and requires attention. He was getting better at attention. Attention, he had discovered, was not the same as focus. Focus was something he had always been very good at, the narrow, intense, targeted application of energy to a problem or a goal. Attention was broader, softer, more patient. Focus asks, what I need from this. Attention asks, what is this? He was learning to ask, what is this? He asked at the school assembly when Charlie was presenting the November Kale, and the assembly room smelled of elementary school, that particular smell of many small people in one space with the thermostat set slightly too high. He asked it at the farmer's market when he and Charlie were at the bread stand, and Charlie was explaining to the bread vendor, seriously and with citation, the history of sourdough fermentation and its relationship to ancient Egyptian agricultural practices. And the vendor was nodding the way adults nod when a child is saying something that they cannot fully follow, but sense is real. He asked it on Tuesday evenings when the phone call went long and Elena's voice got slower with tiredness, and he said, "Go to sleep," and she said, "In a minute," and they stayed on the phone in comfortable silence for a while, which is the highest form of being at ease with someone, silence on a phone call that neither person ends. What is this? This is the level. This is a thing he had been building toward without knowing it, or building away from, depending on which direction you were looking. This is a level that does not produce anything and requires nothing and is simply itself, a person awake in their life, available in the garden. He called his father on a Tuesday evening in December, before the Columbus call. His father said, "How is Columbus?" He said, "Columbus is good. Columbus is really good." His father said, in the woman, he said, "She is not a project, and she is not easy, and she is the best person I know." His father said, in the child, he said, "The child is going to change everything." I say that without hyperbole. The child is going to do something that no one can predict because Charlie approaches the world as if it is entirely remakeable, which is the most dangerous and most necessary kind of intelligence. His father said, "Sounds like someone." He said, "I had more doubt at that age." His father said, "You had more evidence that doubt was warranted." Sounds like this kid has better evidence. He said, "Because of her mother." His father said, "Yes, and because of you." He said, "I'm not a parent." His father said, "You are in the practice of it." He said, "Is that a thing?" His father said, "It is the thing." He said, "Being a parent is not a fact. It is a practice. It is a daily practice of being present and paying attention and being available." He said, "The biology of it is the beginning, not the whole thing. The whole thing is what you actually do." He sat with that. He said, "Pop." His father said, "Yeah." He said, "Thank you." His father said, "For what?" He said, "For Cincinnati, for the truck, for the 3 jobs, for making it real so that I would know, later, that real was possible." His father was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You know what your grandmother used to say about that?" He said, "About 3 jobs and truck?" His father said, "About doing hard things for the right reasons. She used to say, the effort is not what costs you. The effort is easy when you know what it's for. What costs you is the not knowing." He said, "And now I know." His father said, "Sounds like it." He said, "It was a granola bar the whole time." His father said, "It always is. Different shape for different people. Same granola bar." He thought about that for a long time. The same granola bar. All of human kindness is, in some sense, the same granola bar, the same act of noticing, the same decision to deliver, the same faith that the person receiving it will carry it forward. Even if you never find out how, even if 24 years pass and you never know whether the man in the terrible coat went anywhere worth going, even if all you ever have is the faith of the delivery and not the evidence of a defect. Elena had the evidence now. She had been collecting it, he thought, for months, or maybe for longer, maybe since he had first come to the hospital room door, and she had looked at it with the face of someone who had sent $8 into the universe and was now watching the universe deliver. She had been watching the delivery with the measured satisfaction of someone who is not surprised by it, but who is nonetheless moved. She told him, one evening in her kitchen, that she wanted to start writing things down. He said, "What things?" She said, "All of it. The whole thing, from the volunteer cart to now." She said, "I have been thinking about the fact that Charlie knows the story because I told it, but the telling is not the same as the having." She said, "I want there to be a record." He said, "For who?" She said, "For Charlie. When Charlie is older and things get complicated, because they will get complicated." She said, "Because they always do. I want Charlie to be able to read the whole thing and remember that it started with a granola bar and $8 and a man who answered a wrong number call. And it was not magic, and it was not luck. It was faith in small things, and faith in small things is the only faith that lasts." He said, "Let me help." She said, "You write like an engineer." He said, "I know." She said, "I'll write it. You can edit." He said, "Deal." She wrote. He edited. It took most of the winter. They worked on it on Saturday mornings when Charlie was at a friend's house. The two of them at her kitchen table with the address book still on the counter and coffee in the mugs that had been washed so many times they had become exactly themselves. And she wrote longhand first and then typed it. And he read it and asked questions and occasionally said, "Can you say more here?" Or, "I don't think this part is in the right order." And she said, "It is my story." And he said, "You're right." And she kept it. When it was done, she had it printed and bound. 3 copies. One for Charlie, sealed, with instructions not to open until Charlie was 18. One for him. One she kept on the shelf next to the address book. He read his copy that night. He sat in his Columbus house in February. 1 year, almost exactly, since it arrived, and read the story of 2 people connected by a cart and a granola bar and a 24-year gap and an $8 Venmo request, and a child who sat in the dark at 3 in the morning and trusted that the world was full of people worth calling. It was beautifully written. He had expected it to be. She was someone who had always known what to say and how, but it was beautiful in a way that surprised him. The way the best writing surprises you not with what it adds, but with what it does not need. She had not decorated it. She had not explained his feelings or her feelings, had not told the reader what to think. She had just said what happened, in order, and trusted the what to carry the weight. She had ended it this way. She had written, "Some things have a shape that you cannot see until they're finished. A tree does not know it is a tree when it is a seed. A bridge does not know it is a bridge when it is 2 separate banks with water between them. What we were at the beginning was just 2 people, one with a cart and a box of donated granola bars and a faith she could not have explained, one in a waiting room with a terrible coat and a life he had not yet lived. What we became is something that does not have a name in any of the categories the world provides. It is not family, though it has become familiar. It is not romance, though it is full of tenderness. It is not charity, though it is generous. It is the thing that happens when 2 people decide, at different moments and for different reasons, that the connection is worth keeping. I kept his number. He answered the phone. That is the whole story. Everything else is what grew from it. He sat with those words for a long time. He looked around his Columbus house, at the second-hand lamp Charlie had chosen, and the dishes that were just dishes, and the legal pad on the counter with its accumulated months of trying to understand what was happening. He looked at the yard, dark now. February dark. The garden dormant under cold, not gone but resting, gathering itself for spring. He thought about the granola bar, still moving. He thought about Charlie, sealed copy on a shelf, 18 years away. He thought about the version of himself who had almost gone back to sleep. He was very glad he had not gone back to sleep. He was very glad his thumb had hovered and pressed, and a phone had rung twice, and a child had been crying, and he had sat up in the dark and said hello. Hello. Such a small word. The whole thing was small words. $8. Hey, Charlie, I'm a friend. Do it. Nothing is going to happen to you. Available. I kept his number. He answered the phone. That is the whole story. Everything else is what grew from it. He picked up the legal pad. He wrote, below everything he had written the month before, at the bottom of the last page, in the clear space where there had been nothing, and it is still growing. He put the legal pad down. He looked at the yard. He thought, spring is coming. He went to sleep. The granola bar is still moving. Answer your phone.